Slipknot's discography has gone from 1999 to the present, and they're still one of the most present, if not the most present, current metal act, other than, maybe Metallica. And today I'm going to be doing a discography ranking from the self-titled to We Are Not Your Kind. I'm not going to be including Mate, Feed, Kill, Repeat. It is technically a Slipknot release, but I'm not going to include it because I don't feel like it's as important to their overall discography, and it was in many ways more of a glorified demo than anything. So yeah, let's move on. Right, so Slipknot's self-titled was incredibly, I assume it would be incredibly refreshing to see it coming out in, 1999 in a landscape where you had bands like Cold Chamber and Korn and Limp Bizkit. Sure, nu metal was not bad by any stretch of the imagination, but it was not quite heavy enough or fast enough compared to things metal had already done in the past. I mean, we had death metal before nu metal. I think that says a lot. And, Slipknot came onto the self-titled with, songs like Surfacing or Sick or Eyeless that, even though they definitely have the nu metal drumming and that nu metal atmosphere and some kind of alt metal production, it was far more aggressive and heavy than anything else that had been in the mainstream metal scene at the time, and it was an incredibly important album. This came out the same year as Korn's Issues. Listen to the song from that album and the song from the self-titled to clearly see the difference. And the production on this record is not great. Quite frankly, it sounds like it was recorded in a basement. It does not sound very good. But I think some of the band's most iconic songs, the band's fan favorite songs, are mostly from this album. Wait and Bleed, Spit It Out. These are all, especially Spit It Out on the live shows. This is an incredibly important album for the band. But I do have a few gripes. First of all, I feel the song Tattered and Torn is not great. I think the transition from incredibly fast and heavy in the first section of the album to experimental and off-putting with Tattered and Torn was a bit choppy. I don't think it works very well. I think it's a bit abrupt, and I think it kind of breaks up the flow of the album. I think if they removed that, it would have flowed much nicer into Me Inside. Along with that, I want to say that I'm not crazy about the song Prosthetics or Scissors. They're both good songs, but I think if they had removed them, the album would have been much shorter, much easier to digest, and I think overall it could have been a lot cleaner. So with all those things put together, I'm going to put Slipknot self-titled into the B category. So next up we have Iowa, my personal favorite from the band. This album, where do I start with this album? Iowa was, remarkable at the time. And I think it's really, on a lot of levels, a miracle that this record even got play on the radio, which it didn't for the most part, but on a lot of mainstream stations, metal, Slipknot were a big band, and they even stated in interviews at the time, and even still to this day, the record studio just wanted them to go in and record 12 Wait and Bleeds and say, okay, let's put it on the radio, let's go play live. But they didn't want to do that. I forget what the first song they recorded was. If I recall correctly, it was Skin Ticket. And they realized that they wanted to go in a much darker direction. And that darker direction also worked because it was definitely fueled by the band's current mental state. Corey Taylor and Clown, namely, really do discuss how when they recorded this album, it was an incredibly dark time. All of them were in a really bad state mentally. And I think it shines through on every single song on this album. You have stuff like People Equal Shit and Disaster Piece that I feel really just radiate the energy that this album is attempting to drive home. I think the most underrated track on the album, Metabolic, it drives home the anger so clearly. And when you listen to Metabolic and you listen to Corey's raw vocals, you just can feel the anger and just the raw passion and emotion that's just radiating throughout this song. as Corey just has, different registers in his voice each chorus, because all of his screams are different, because all of them are so genuine, and there's no bullshit behind it. Along with that, this is probably my favorite guitar tone out of any Slipknot album. It just sounds very thick and meaty, and I think it works so well in the mix, especially alongside Joey's drumming. I think Paul has some really cool bass lines, rest in peace. And, I mean, all of these things put together, this album is a masterpiece, in my opinion. It's the band's best release. Joey's drumming is, okay, maybe alt or nu metal styled, but it's aggressive, it's fast, there's a lot of double kick, there's a lot of fills. The drum fill in the Heretic Anthem and People Equal Shit, I think it drives it home. I think Slipknot went a lot harder with maybe their more provocative side on this album. As I said just a moment ago, the songs like Heretic Anthem, I feel like they really went into a harsh, aggressive direction. And it's just it's so odd that this album did as well as it did. And I think it's for two things. One, I do think it's because they were riding on the high of the first album. Slipknot's debut record was incredibly influential and effective. If you look at videos of them playing live back then at not just Ozfest, but Dynamo and some other big festivals, you see the crowds, you see the people, you realize like the band was just doing incredibly well at the time, and I think they rode that high just perfectly leading into this album. And secondly, I think it's such a genuine album. I think even people who weren't metalheads probably clung to it just because it felt so genuine, There's nothing on this album that feels like bullshit the whole entire time. You just feel this raw aggression and depression radiating from the album. And there's some really good deeper cuts on this record as well that are just so underrated. A song like New Abortion, Skin Ticket, I Am Hated, The Shape, Metabolic, Gently, these are all incredibly underrated songs. And I think this album really showed what Slipknot were capable of. I think it showed that they were an incredibly aggressive and fast-paced band when they wanted to be, but they were also capable of going into a slightly quieter sound, not quieter, but something gently. It shows they could do the experimentation thing well when they wanted to. And a song like Iowa just shows just this raw, untamed aggression that just is so harsh and so degrading throughout the whole thing. I think when you get to that 15-minute long song, Iowa, it builds up, and it just makes you, feel the effects of the whole thing, and then when that ends, it's like, it's almost a relief, because you just went through this whole album. So, for all those reasons, I'm gonna have to put Iowa into the S category. Coming off the bat of Iowa, the band definitely made a name for themselves, if they hadn't already after the self-titled. Corey Taylor and I believe Jim Root had just recorded Stone Sour's first record after they had their reunion, and they went back into the studio, and they recorded Volume 3. Now, this is a conflicting record, especially at the time it was. They come off the back of something like Iowa that I think is a lot more extreme and a lot less clean, and then, they go into an album like Volume 3 where it's heavy, but it's a lot less untamed, and it's a lot less in your face, and it feels much more controlled, unless, while Iowa is just kind of all over the place. And, I really love Volume 3, because this album feels like a perfect amalgamation, a perfect compilation of everything that they had made beforehand. And it feels like they just took everything that was amazing from self-titled and Iowa and all of their amazing ideas from beforehand and just kind of crushed it into this album. And, I think some of the band's best work exists on this record. There are some really classic songs. Some are a little bit more underrated than others. The Blister exists. Opium of the People. Uh, the Nameless is a really big one. I love The Nameless. That's probably in my top 5 favorite Slipknot songs. It just works really well. And that, Vermilion Part 2 is classic, of course. That's a really great song. It's interesting because I don't even think Slipknot are that great at the whole slower, more emotional side of things, but I do think they pulled it off really well in that song, and that's definitely in my top 10. I really do enjoy that track. But this album, unfortunately, has a lot of faults for me, and I do have to talk about that. One, I don't like the drum and guitar tone on this record. Namely, the guitars, to me at least, as a guitarist, compared to the first two albums, the guitars feel a bit thinner, and I don't think that they sounded quite as good in the mix. Maybe they had more mids in their amps, but I don't really like either of, Mick or Jim's guitar tone on this album. I think they both dialed in very well together, but I don't really feel that their guitar tones as a whole were very good. Moving on, my second thing I don't really like about this record, I don't like that they kept the last 2 tracks from the album. I do not care at all for The Virus of Life. I don't think that track's that solid. I don't think it means much, and I think they could have removed that. I love the track Danger Keep Away, but maybe keep it as a B-side. For me, it really does not fit into the grand scheme of this album. I guess it does end it quite well, but I think if they had ended on The Nameless, on that aggressive note, it would have made the album, I think, end a lot smoother and a lot more with its point driven across. I think if they cut those 2 songs off, everything would have just run smoother, and I probably would have liked this album more. But, I mean, aside from all those things, this album is still, by all means, a great work. It's insanely better than the self-titled, but I don't think it's quite at the same level as Iowa, so I'm going to go ahead and drop Volume Through the Subliminal Verses into the A category. Moving on, it had been around 4 years at this point since Slipknot released this album, and now this is, I think, a controversial album in many ways. All Hope Is Gone is not talked about a lot by the fans, but I gotta say, I really do enjoy this album. I think it's incredibly underrated. I think it's really well done, and so I do have to go very in-depth with it. All Hope Is Gone is known even by the band, not just by fans and people, as not necessarily being a sellout album, but being a lot more radio-oriented. And I mean, I hear that on a song like Dead Memories, or even, a song like Snuff. But at the same time, I think there's some really heavy shit on this album. I mean, Gematria, or, The Killing Name, is insanely good. It feels really thrashy. It's kind of like the Master of Puppets of Slipknot. It feels very reminiscent of an 80s thrash thing. Psychosocial, it's pretty heavy, but I think the main important thing about that song is just that it launched the band as such a, into like the stratosphere. It was such a big hit. That's still their biggest song, other than maybe Duality. And I really feel like, that song just had such an influential effect. And to this day, that's like one of the only songs to them I hear on like the terrestrial radio, because it's the biggest one. It's the only one that they want to play. And even, Sulfur, coming off the back of The Killing Name, I think Sulfur's a really, really good song. It goes a bit more into the melodic radio element once again, but I don't think that's the band selling out. I think they implemented it in a really good, well-oriented way with that track, and I think that they did a really good job with it. Whereas, on some other songs, it's not that great. There is some forgettable stuff in this album, infamously, Butcher's Hook, stuff like that. It's not memorable with songs like that. But, again, there's great stuff like All Hope Is Gone, the self-titled song. And, I guess, Snuff, not everybody likes it. A lot of people don't care for it. I think it's great. I think it's very similar to Vermilion Part 2 in theme and energy, but I think it's very different, and I do prefer Vermilion Part 2 significantly, although I I genuinely still enjoy that song, and I think it's very well done. I love the guitar solo. It's very simple and not like insanely thought out, but I think it's very good. I think it's very effective, and I think it really expands on the atmosphere of that track. But All Hope Is Gone nowadays is not talked about a lot, and I think it's because Slipknot experimented on this album, but they experiment on all their albums almost. I feel like, on Iowa they got heavier and meaner. On Vermilion, I'm sorry, not Vermilion Part 2, on Volume 3, they got a lot more, I think, refined. I think on that album they refined their sound. But on this album, I don't think they changed much. I think it's different. I think Slipknot always experiment with every single album. But this album does not, by any stretch of the imagination, push Slipknot's boundaries. And I think that's a part of why it's not really liked. So I don't want to put this album into C, because I don't think it's at that quality, but it's not as good as Vermilion Part 2. As Volume 3, I don't know why I keep saying that. And it's not as good as the self-titled. It's not nearly as classic. So I will still put it in the B category, but at a lower B than the self-titled album. Moving on, following, of course, the death of bassist Paul Gray and the leaving of Joey Jordison, Slipknot were just in such a hard, I guess a rock in a hard place, you could say. They were not in really a good position here. A lot of people were even talking about, Slipknot gonna break up. They had All Hope Is Gone, which, even though it did very well, it was not super loved by the fans, and then Paul Gray passed away. That already took a toll on the band. And then Joey Jordison was, unfortunately, fired. That's controversial to say about that, what you will. But, I feel like Point 5, The Great Chapter, it was obviously the return for this band, but although it was the return, it was not, by any stretch of the imagination, one of their best albums. I think it's probably the worst up until this point. But despite that, it's so important because it drove home the point that Slipknot were going to be able to come back from losing 2 members. And there's some really cool songs on this album. Sarcastrophe, which is a great name. I have that song. The riffs on that song, they're cool. They sound great. I like them. I think it's a good track. The Devil and I, which is just a classic song, obviously. But I gotta say, I like XIX. That's a good opener. I enjoy that. I think it works well. It maybe could have been a better ending to the album. But generally, I don't think this record is that great. There's not much memorable other than that for me personally, with songs like If Rain Is What You Want and stuff. There's 16 songs, I believe, on this album, which is crazy. It's not, I don't think this record really impressed anyone. I don't think anybody's impressed by this record. But once again, you need to think about it at the time that it came out. This was such an important album, and even if when we look back at it, we realize it was not that great, I'm sure it was really important for the band. The band is fairly technical on it. I'm sure they showed their abilities. The point is, this album is great because it shows that the band still had left in them the ability to produce a good album. They still had the want to produce a good album, the passion to produce a good album. And so this record is really, really important for that reason. Overall, I think I'm going to have to put Point 5, The Great Chapter, into the C category. It's not as good as the former in B, but I don't think it's worthy of a D. I don't think it's that bad. It's just the album's forgettable. That's its main downfall. It's forgettable, and I don't think the production's very good. There's not a lot wrong with this record. It's just forgettable, and therefore, not a lot of Slipknot's forgettable. So that says a lot, and it's important to keep that in mind, because it is a meaningful thing, because Slipknot's usually not very forgettable, in my opinion. So I'm going to have to put this into the C category. So next we have We Are Not Your Kind. I gotta say, I fucking love this album. This is my first or my second favorite from the band. It's probably my second from Iowa. That's not a super popular opinion, but still, this record is really fucking great for me. I feel like, sorry, that's my cat. I think, Point 5, The Great Chapter, was more kind of showing, Slipknot are still a band. Holy shit, they're still around. They're still have They still are one of the best bands in the world. But this album, I feel, really perfected that concept. I feel like this album really drove home that narrative. And I mean, there's not, for me at least, there's not a single forgettable song on this album. Unsainted is amazing. Nero Forte is amazing. Red Flag is amazing. Critical Darling's amazing. A Liar's Funeral is amazing. Orphan's amazing. Spiders is amazing. Soul Wafer is amazing. You get the point. People don't like My Pain. I like My Pain. It's not the most memorable song, but I think it's executed well, and I think it works well in the grand scheme of the album. And yeah, I mean, this album for me, I like to think, sure, Volume 3 was a compilation of everything that they had done before in the past, but this record really, I feel, is a compilation of everything in the past, including All Hope Is Gone, Volume 3, and Point 5, The Great Chapter. This album, for me, it just feels like it feels like a perfect compilation. I think the band is the most mature they've ever been on this album. It has Iowa levels of heavy, but I think it has Volume 3 levels of mature. And, it has just a perfect mix. It has a perfect mix of everything. If you look at an element from the self-titled, there's an element from the self-titled in this album. There's an element from All Hope Is Gone in this album. I feel like the band put everything together. And I really do believe that this is the closest the band has gotten to Iowa since Iowa. And I really do think this is arguably one of the best Slipknot releases. I don't think it gets too much attention. I still think it's newer. I think in coming years this album's going to be looked at really, really fondly. But yeah, for all those reasons, I'm going to have to throw We Are Not Your Kind into an S tier, which is a bit biased, but I don't care. So that's going to conclude everything for this video. I think I've covered everything fairly well. I think there's probably more I could go in depth with. Sorry, we have a cameo here. Yeah, put your thoughts in the comments below or anything. Subscribe or like if you want. And yeah, I'll see you next time.